Alrighty then folks, I apologize for the lighting in this video. I have to kind of make this one really quick, but basically there are a couple of changes coming to the channel, one of which you might have already seen, which is that I've actually updated the logo. So part of that is because I'm trying to kind of rebuild the brand around the channel entirely, and hopefully I'll also have a couple of things like merch and stuff like that figured out in a little bit so that we have some of that on the channel as well. But in the meantime, a couple of other things have happened. So for one, I'm actually using the Saramonic wireless mic system. It's a lav mic. So now I'll be able to actually record VR videos and not have to face the shotgun mic that I had before. I had the Rode Video Micro Pro mic, and it's a really good quality mic. But unfortunately, when you end up turning away from it, obviously, you know, it's not able to record the audio clearly. Now with the Saramonic, that shouldn't be an issue anymore because it'll actually be capturing my audio as I turn without me having to face the mic, since it's going to be on my person the entire time. I'm going to do kind of a review for that system once I've had it for a little while, but this video is going to be capturing the audio from that mic. So you'll see kind of the difference there. The other big thing that has happened, and the primary focus for this video, is actually this GTX 1080 Ti that I have in front of me. As you can see, I have a Heatkiller waterblock on there. Now I had to kind of mess around with it because it actually did not fit properly onto this card. I had actually assumed that you know, this card was more or less a reference design. It's a Gigabyte Aorus 1080 Ti. Unfortunately, the card is not a reference design, so things didn't exactly fit. I had to get rid of the DVI port on the card, and also, as you can see, I've had to zip tie parts of the GPU water block onto it because it was actually kind of sticking out quite a decent bit. Now the water block seems to be doing just fine otherwise, so I'll have to kind of wait and see if there's any other modifications that I need to make in order to make this thing fit, which you know, it may be possible that I'll need to do a couple more things before it really actually sticks to this thing properly. As it stands right now though, it's a really nice block, and even though I looked at other water blocks, you know, the problem was that basically none of them really fit the Aorus Ti. Now, there are water blocks that say they're designed for the Aorus, but just looking at them and looking at the whole layout for mounting, it doesn't really look like any of them really fit. And this one looks really neat. It's got a really cool design. Again, full copper for the water block itself, which is a huge bonus. It does make this thing quite hefty, but on the other hand, I think the cooling is going to be such a nice difference between the other water blocks that it shouldn't really matter. So this will be the card that I will now be using for my videos and my VR videos, which also means that I will be doing some video benchmarks with the Vega FE versus this card to see just how much better this thing performs. Now I am using about 5 gigs of RAM with this thing, so it's going to be 11 gigs as opposed to 16, but as it stands, this should give me just plenty enough of VRAM to run most of the VR games today. And, you know, last but not least, I'll be showing you guys how I actually got rid of the DVI port on this thing and how I mounted the heating block more or less. So you'll kind of see that and see how it works. And in the next video that I'll be doing after this one, I'll actually be showing you guys my new green screen. So I'll be using a green screen to help make the VR videos a little bit more immersive. You'll also be able to see the environment around me better, as opposed to me just showing you what is happening basically through the HMD only. You'll be able to see a little bit more of the world and the environment that way. So that's coming. Stick around for that. But in the meantime, let's take a look at how I got this thing up and running, and then we'll go from there. Okay folks, so at this point in time, what I'm doing here is taking the card apart with the stock cooler that was in place before. Now you can see that on the back there's a couple of screws. There are going to be basically 3 of them in this sort of top upper section here, and then you'll also see that there are 4 screws that are holding the actual GPU in place itself. I'm going to take those out, and once those are all entirely apart, you'll be able to basically take the card off. Now you do want to be slightly careful about removing the card from the actual PCB because the fans in this have little connectors, and there's 2 of them. There's one sort of towards the very front, and there's one sort of in the rear middle that you'll need to take off before you're able to fully dislodge the PCB from the cooler itself. So just look out for that as you're taking this thing off. And obviously you'll want to store the screws in an area where you don't end up losing them, so that'll make it just a little bit easier for you as you take the card apart. Okay, so you can see here now that I'm just removing this last bit here before we move on to actually fully disassembling the card and test fitting the cooler itself, and you'll see that in a second here. Alright, so here we go. We're taking out the cooler now as the card is now fully apart. So we're going to take off the top part there, and we're just going to basically open this guy up. You can see there's the Heatkiller cooler right there. It comes in a little plastic case, and then it comes with a bunch of little kind of sticky thermal pads that you'll be able to stick onto the cooling components, or the components that need to get cooled on the GPU itself. So it'll come with a couple of those, as well as screws to attach it to the card as well. Now you can see again that it doesn't entirely line up with this card, because at this point the DVI port is still in the way. Now what I have found is that Heatkiller does make a Titan version of this cooler, which will actually have a slot open for the DVI if your 1080 has a DVI port. But in my case, I realized that I'm going to have to just take this thing off entirely before I'm able to proceed. So in this next section, I'm going to show you guys how I desoldered the actual pins to the best degree that I could, given that I don't have a hot air rework station, and you will see sort of the next steps that I took in terms of removing the DVI port so that it could actually come off cleanly, and so that we'd be able to mount this cooler while still maintaining the same profile. So here is basically the unglorified montage of me putting this kind of thing together, in the sense that, you know, I've got my desoldering gun here, and essentially you want to preheat the pins as much as possible before you end up taking the DVI port itself off. You can see here that it takes kind of a while to get through all the separate sections that are on there. Now, at this point in time, I think that I managed to get most of them, but not all. If, again, you have a hot air rework station, this is a lot easier, obviously. But in my case, I ended up basically removing as many of them as I could before proceeding on to sort of more or less destructively take the DVI port off of the card. For most folks, the DVI port is not really a necessity at this point in time. It's, kind of a redundancy, and by and large, you're not going to be using DVI for most anything nowadays anyhow. So it doesn't really serve too big of a purpose, especially on this card, and making it a single slot obviously means that I'm able to fit other PCIe cards into my main board, which is the whole kind of purpose for this, and also to keep this card as same single slot design as I had on the Vega FE. So you can see here, I'm going to kind of speed through this part because it basically is just more of me kind of heating up the pins and removing the solder using the desolder gun. If you want to get the same one that I have, you can take a look at it on Amazon. I believe it's like $50, so not terribly expensive, and it will get you most of the way there. If you happen to have basically one of those butane-powered desoldering torches, then that's also, a huge plus. But obviously be careful to not heat up the components that are next to what you're actually trying to desolder. I ended up using my air rework station for a part of this. But unfortunately, you want to be extra careful because mine doesn't have an extra hood to prevent the other components from heating up, and there are a lot of little pieces on there that you can inadvertently heat up and cause issues later on with the card malfunctioning. So again, just be careful when you're doing this, because you want to make sure that you only heat up the components that you're actually trying to take off. Okay, so here you can see that I've now covered basically all of the RAM and the VRMs on the card as well. So those now have the little thermal pad, the thermal transfer pad on them. Now at this point you can basically mount the card to the cooler, but again you want to be careful in terms of any sort of hardware that overlaps. In this particular card's case, there are some chokes, or what I believe to be chokes, that kind of end up sticking out a little bit and contacting the copper on the Heatkiller cooler. But as it stands, at this point you're basically good to go. Now, the row that you see that aren't being covered, I think should be okay. I'm going to try and see if I can get a heat reading on those as the card starts up, to see how bad they actually do, and if they do need additional cooling, I'll see if I can just get some custom little pieces to go across there to cool them separately via an air-cooled method. So the first thing that you want to do here is you want to kind of take a small screwdriver, ideally a flathead, and you want to insert it into the middle of this tab here. What you're going to do then is you're going to slowly pry side to side until you're actually able to get this little aluminum cover to pop off. Once you do get the cover to pop off, all you need to do is just kind of rock it back and forth. There's a little kind of tab towards the very bottom of this piece, which you can then bend forwards and backwards until it completely falls off. This only takes a couple of rocking motions, so just stick with it until you're done. Now the next order of business that you'll have here is the metal around these little towers that actually are on the sides of the DVI port. What you want to do there is just take some pliers and basically again just sort of rock them forward and back until they pop off. Now depending on the DVI port layout that you have, they may be attached to the actual PCB itself, or they may be more or less free floating. In my case, mine were in fact attached to the PCB, so when you do rock them, just make sure that you're careful in terms of removing them, and make sure that you remove them fully. That way you're actually able to pop off the plastic at the bottom when you're done with this step. Now once you do have the sort of metal rails removed, what you'll see is that there are the actual pins that go into the DVI port from the PCB. So what you want to do at that point is you basically want to take your pliers and you want to start pulling these guys apart, and I'll show you in the next image what I mean there. Now also at this point you may want to consider heating up the pins from the bottom so that it takes it, a little bit less effort to actually move them out of the PCB, and that way they can rock freely, and all you'd have to do is just lightly pull to remove them. Alright, so here you can see now that the pieces are slowly coming out. Now from the top section you will have to pull them with some force, but from the bottom it should be a little bit easier once you heat them up to actually remove the pins, and I recommend doing them one by one. Don't try and do them two pieces at a time, because you can mess up the plastic at the bottom, which will then make it significantly more difficult for you to remove the pieces as needed. So again, just take your time removing these pins and make sure that you're careful not to kind of, drag them off and scrape them against the PCB or other small components that are nearby. That way you limit the damage to only the DVI port itself. Alright, so eventually what you will end up seeing is you will have something that looks like this. Now at this point you can see that you still have sort of the two towers that are hanging out within the DVI port itself. What I did here is I started to basically pry apart the top plastic piece where the DVI cable typically connects. Once I got that sort of, removed, then you're able to start working at the two side towers there to be able to remove this thing a heck of a lot easier, and I'll show you what I mean now. So here you can see that at this point I've removed the plastic piece for the actual DVI port itself, and you can see I've also wiggle free one of the towers as well. Now you do have to be a little bit more careful in this section, because these towers are right next to the DVI ports, or the display ports down there, so you want to make sure that you don't damage the ports you'll be using when moving these towers apart. So what I recommend doing is doing a twisting motion that doesn't end up rocking the towers onto the ports below. That'll be the most ideal kind of way to go forward, and then once you've sort of removed those pieces, you'll see that at that point the actual plastic near the PCB should be able to wiggle free fairly easily. If it doesn't, just take your time. What you can do at this point as well is you can see that there are four little connectors that are holding the DVI port onto the PCB itself. So if you have those little kind of wire cutters that you can get at your typical hardware store, especially if they're the skinny wire cutters, you should be able to pry the plastic port open a little bit and then cut the supports if you haven't desoldered them completely already. If you did desolder them, then sometimes applying just a little bit of extra heat and then using pliers to take the plastic off will make your life 10 times easier in terms of getting this port out of the PCB itself. Alright, and so here you can see the plastic bit once the towers themselves have been removed. Now again, on your card it may look similar, it may look slightly different depending on how the DVI port is attached, but for the most part, as I've said, this piece should remove fairly easily. As you can see in my case, I still had a couple of pins that just were stubborn and wouldn't come out. So what I ended up doing is once the actual plastic port came off, I simply wiggled them until they broke off, and that made it a lot easier. That way I didn't have to do any additional heating, potentially damaging other components in the process. So this is the method that I would recommend using, again, if you don't have a full reflow station that you can use to actually get the pieces loose. And as I've said before, again, unless you have a professional reflow station, attempting this with an air rework station can be pretty dangerous, because some of these little components that you can see off to the sides, if you heat up the PCB enough, sometimes that makes it hot enough for them to actually come loose, and they'll just pop right out of the the solder that they're on and the main board, and that's really bad, because then you have no clue which direction they were facing, and potentially you've got a dud of a card, because getting them back on without damaging other components nearby is dang near impossible without the original industrial equipment that actually soldered them in place. You may be able to take them to somebody that is able to do the work for you, but again, the cost there would be pretty astronomical, I would imagine, compared to you just not screwing up in the first place. So again, I recommend that stay away from air rework stations if you don't have a professional setup at home, and mainly just apply heat using a soldering iron. Specifically, if you do get a chance to have a butane soldering iron, then that makes it easier, because the heat that they're able to produce is typically higher than those of the electrical models, so you're able to actually remove components a heck of a lot easier that way. So here's what my end product more or less looks like. As you can see, again, it mounts up fairly nicely. The problem is, again, there are some components that, due to the design of this block being meant for a reference card, means that it's not sitting completely flush. Now I'm going to be looking at potentially getting this block machined, because I do want to keep it to see if I can't kind of make these components fit a little bit better. Ideally, once I've got that all kind of in place, this card will be sitting completely flush, and all the components will be getting the proper cooling that they need, and that way, the whole card will be kind of getting uniform cooling across all of the different components, the VRMs, the chokes, so on and so forth. That way, there's no kind of heat spots that end up appearing on the card. Now, I believe that they do sell a backplate for this thing, which would potentially help prevent any further warping of the PCB itself. I don't know if I'll be getting that. I want to just make sure that I get the card kind of uniform across the whole block, so that it sits nice and flat. Now, what you don't see here is that I've also actually removed the front kind of plastic connector that was on the water block previously, because that interfered with the power connectors on the card, as well as the two capacitors that you see hanging off in the front there as well. So that's something else that I did to modify this block to make this thing fit. And, last but not least, I also removed one of the fan connectors, which normally would have been sitting where my thumb is at right now, but on the other side. And so that one was interfering with some of the copper that's on the block as well. So now you can see kind of at the front is where the majority of the issues seem to appear for this water block as it stands right now. Again, I'm going to be looking to see if I can clear out that. You can see that there's a little piece of copper that sticks up and ends up contacting one of the pieces on the card right there. So I think sort of being able to machine that off will allow the card to sit slightly more flush, and then at that point I'll take the block to the shop so I can have an opening machined for that component within the copper block itself. That's not going to affect any of the water cooling, because the water doesn't actually penetrate into the copper itself. It mainly has a little channel built out in the center where it cools, and then the rest of this thing just acts as more of a heat sink at that point. So again, not terrible to make some modifications to the copper block to make this whole thing fit, but it makes it just good enough so that you're able to get proper cooling for the rest of the components as needed, without necessarily having to bother with potentially having to order another block. This one looks really nice, and I think the copper means that the cooling will be quite significant, especially combined with the water cooling setup that I have, where I have a really fast flowing pump, and I have a dual fan, dual 120 millimeter fan radiator, which will provide plenty of cooling for this card, since it's capable of keeping my Vega card at a pretty constant, like 38 to 40 degrees Celsius under load. So I think that with the Vega being as hot as it is, this card will do even better. I'm hoping for temperatures of no more than like 35 with this block and the water cooling setup that I have. So I think, you know, overclocking this thing and then running it through the block, I shall have pretty good temperatures, and if I need to, I can step up to a bigger radiator that's potentially, you know, thicker and has triple 120 mil fans versus double if I do need additional cooling in place, but I think I'll be okay with the card as is. So you guys, this is basically my build. Again, I'll be going over this card and benchmarks once I get everything put into my system. So stick around for that video, stick around for more VR videos. And again, you know, if you like the video, give me a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification button if you want to receive any new updates on the videos that I have posted. I'll see you all in the next one.